Hello everyone, welcome to Within the Frame, where we delve deeper into the top stories not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Over 10 years ago, a massive earthquake and tsunami destroyed Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. It caused reactors to melt down and large amounts of radioactivity contaminated the ocean. Huge damage was also inflicted on the region's fishing industry. But this is not the end of the story. Water was needed to cool down the damaged reactors, and along with polluted groundwater that infiltrated the site, contaminated water had to be pumped out and has been stored in over 1,000 tanks. But space is running out, and with the risk of a leak caused by potential earthquakes or typhoons in 2021, the Japanese government decided to discharge the water as early as this spring after going through its own treatment system. But is it really safe to do so? And what sort of treatment work is needed beforehand? For an in-depth analysis of the Fukushima water release issue, we invited two very special guests. Dr. Ferenc Donoki-Veres, scientist in residence and adjunct professor from Middlebury Institute of International Studies, who is one of Pacific Islands Forum's expert panelists for the Fukushima release. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And we also have Walter Sim, Japan correspondent from the Straits Times. Mr. Sim, welcome and thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Walter, for the first question, for those who are not familiar with the issue, what justification did Japanese authorities give for their decision to discharge more than 1 million tons of water from the Fukushima plant into the sea?
Well, I think I should give a very quick background so as to bring everybody up to speed on this issue. So the Fukushima Daiichi power plant was inundated by tsunami waves after the March 11, 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. The plant has been shut down since it is being decommissioned, but it is still continuously generating contaminated radioactive water as a byproduct. Now, this water is being stored in tanks at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, and it is intended to be released after it's undergone a treatment through a process known as ALPS or Alps, the Advanced Liquid Processing System. This process, in a nutshell, is designed to remove all radioactive particles except for an isotope of hydrogen known as tritium. Japan is aware that the decision is politically and diplomatically toxic, but it made the decision to discharge this water into the sea starting from as early as spring this year, because space is fast running out to build new tanks on the site of the plant, and this could be a potential hindrance to the decommissioning process. Now, I think it must be noted that Japan is not acting on this decision by itself. The IAEA, or the International Atomic Energy Agency, has been involved at every single step of the way, and the IAEA has also given the green light to Japan's plans to discharge the water, with the latest regulatory review being held just last week. Now, the IAEA says the Fukushima plant is not unique in discharging such Alps treated water into the ocean. The IAEA says that tritium, as an isotope of hydrogen, already exists in nature, and it may already be in the rainwater, the seawater, or tap water that you drink. The agency also says that tritium is a byproduct of water that is being discharged at nuclear power plants around the world routinely, and these includes countries like France, the US, Canada, China, and even South Korea. So, but Japan knows that it's a controversial decision, and it's trying to assuage its neighbors by further diluting the levels of tritium by 100 times more than necessary to meet the safety thresholds.
Right, Walter, thank you for your background information for our viewers. Now, Dr. Donoki-Veres, to understand the impact of such a release, the Pacific Islands Forum used an independent panel of experts in key fields to provide an assessment. Now, could you tell us more about the organization, and can you describe the assessment process the experts are using?
Sure. So the Pacific Island Forum of Nations, 18 nations, work together on many different issues, like a mini United Nations, when you can think of it from that point of view. We got together these 5 experts, scientist experts, all from different disciplines. So, for example, I'm a physicist and I work on detectors and all these kinds of issues, but we have oceanographers, we have molecular biologists, nuclear engineers, and all kinds of different areas. And we were able to get access through the Pacific Island Forum to get Japan to share some of the data with us. And it's basically 4.3 years of data from the tanks themselves. So looking at the concentrations of what's actually in the tanks. And what we find is that that there's major problems. Immediately when we got the data, also the data was not in the form that was really easy to share. And we analyzed it, and we saw there were issues such as the quality of the data, information was missing. Even in one case, in a couple of cases, the tank ID was missing, so it's very hard to figure out what is what. There was anomalous data, things that just didn't make sense. I want to stress one thing that Walter mentioned, which is, and also the idea of discharge. During normal operations, it is true, and I'm not agreeing with that, but during normal operations, reactors, such as the Korea reactors, release tritiated water with tritium and so on into the sea. But this is not normal operations. And even the word discharge is not really appropriate. According to the IAEA documents themselves, it's a situation where we have 1,000 tanks. I know of no nuclear power plant that I've visited ever where you have 1,000 tanks of water just sitting there. And they have to deal with this massive issue. And if you want to just kind of visualize how much that is, it's like a cube of 110 meters by 110 meters by 110 meters. It's a massive problem that they have to handle.
Right. Now, Walter, Japan said the reason it decided to release the wastewater is that it's running out of space for storing the contaminated water. And Japanese authorities reportedly mulled over several other options before deciding on the ocean discharge plan. Now, what were other options, and why did the Japanese government eventually decide on the ocean discharge plan?
Well, thanks for pointing that out. And I think the Japanese government really decided on this ocean discharge plan because there really are no other good options. So some of the other choices that they were considering include this thing called geosphere injection, where the water will be pumped deep into the earth. There's also hydrogen release, where the water, I believe, will be chemically broken down into hydrogen before it is released into the atmosphere. There's also underground burial, but these are issues which Japan has rejected on grounds that on regulatory grounds, on grounds that the technology is not advanced enough, as well as more time is required to go through the process than necessary with the ocean discharge plan. They also looked at long-term storage, but then again, there are difficulties in securing space both within and outside of the Fukushima Daiichi plant. The last option that they were considering was vapor release, but Japan says that this is less reliable than water discharge, especially with the volumes involved, as Dr. Daonuki has mentioned earlier.
Right. Now, Doctor, before we get to the specific, problems that you were able to see while doing the research and while during the evaluation process, now Japan says the contaminated water will be filtered using the system so-called Alps, right? Advanced Liquid Processing System, and the process will apparently remove most of the isotopes except for some traces of the tritium. Now, could you elaborate more on this specific system, and do you believe it can properly filter the wastewater?
Right. So Alps is a system basically of two components. So one component is called co-precipitation, and that looks for organic compounds and materials like that. Also removes strontium. Then there's also absorption columns. That's the other component to it. And there's different adsorbents that you have which focus on target particular types of elements. And so in the process, if this system would work, then you could, remove all those different materials because it's really targeted for that. Now, I want to stress that in some of the work that I've done where I looked at the data, I found some concerns, and that's the ratio between, and I don't want to get too technical here, between strontium-90, which is a 30-year half-life isotope, which is a concern, divided by to the cesium-137, which is also about 30 years with half-life of that time, varied wildly. and it shouldn't vary wildly. So I mean by varied wildly, I mean like 3 orders of magnitude, factor of 1,000. It should just be 1. And so that means there might be a problem with Alps itself in how it's working. And so that was one of the red flags that we saw immediately. So it's not only the sloppy data that we saw, but it's also the fact that there seems to be some variation here with how Alps is working. Maybe that's related to time, maybe that's related to concentration, and we never really got good answers from TEPCO on this, although we've had 4 meetings with TEPCO officials and with Japan officials, and also one meeting where the IEA was present and so on. We never received good answers for that.
Right, so you're saying that the Alps system itself could have some problems, right?
Yes, and it also did have problems in the past.
Right. Now, Doctor, I'd like to ask you one more. As I have mentioned earlier, even if the Alps system does work, does filter most radioactive isotopes, the tritium, which, as far as I know, is very difficult to remove from water, will still remain. Now, the Tokyo Electric Power Company Holdings, the plant operator, says the impact will be negligible because the treated water will be diluted by large amounts of water, and also it's going to be released very gradually. But how do you see this move, and how concerning is this thing called tritium?
Yeah, so tritium is basically radioactive hydrogen. And as you know, we're made of hydrogen, we're made of carbon and all these different things. But this is the radioactive form. And it is true that, for example, it would make part of water. But there's also something called organically bound tritium, which could get into the system. And when we mentioned this to TEPCO, their response was basically, they basically didn't really give a good response that they've even really heard about this in so much. So that was very, very concerning. But it's not just about dilution and so on. So people focus on dilution is the solution to pollution. Very nice term, right? But that's very simplistic, because you have to think about, for example, marine organisms that take up some of those radionuclides that travel, long distances. An example is that when we think about when Fukushima happened, the radioactive contaminants like cesium-137 and tritium would travel, with these simulations and these calculations, would travel to California, where I live, in about 2 years. But actually in San Diego, they measured within a year a tuna that had elevated levels of cesium. So we know that it's not just ocean currents and all that, but it's also marine life that actually transports it, as a vector would do.
Right, so it's not just a matter of Japan, but rather, the whole globe, because the marine systems could, affect all the globe systems, right?
Right, and that also makes it a transboundary issue.
Right. Now, Walter, there are concerns even from Japanese residents and activists who are protesting the dumping of nuclear wastewater in the ocean. And how does the Japanese public view Tokyo's decision on this nuclear wastewater issue?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think that's a very good point. But before I get into that, I do think that it's very important to raise the concerns by the Pacific Island Forum to the IAEA, especially since TEPCO appears to be a juggernaut that is really charging towards the release of the water in spring with the IAEA's blessings. And well, given that, I do think that it's very important for all opinions to be heard on this front, including from Japanese residents and activists, as you pointed out. This is a matter of livelihoods, especially for those living in the northeast, in Fukushima and its surrounding prefectures. The local governments there actually like to say that there were 4 disasters associated with March 11. It was not just the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear disaster, but more hurtfully what they term as the reputational damage from toxic rumors. And to counter that, their agricultural and fisheries products are undergoing regular testing. Exports have since climbed past pre-disaster levels according to government data. But I do think that this fear is legitimate over the decision to dump wastewater, even if it's Alps treated. There is, of course, going to be potential damage to the Fukushima brand, even if the water is declared safe and even if tests are being done. But I also have to add on to that unfortunately, I think the Japanese public is like any other in how there is collective amnesia and this not in my backyard syndrome. So I do think that yes, the protests have been readily played up by domestic and international media, but my sentiment is that this is really seen as a local and regional issue and not a national one. I don't think people in Western Japan are really that bothered.
Right. Now, Doctor, we actually already pointed out about the effect it's going to have on the ecosystem, but also this kind of harm to ecosystems will inevitably lead to decimation of fishing industries as well. And so not only the local fishing communities, but also those in Pacific Island regions are rejecting fiercely to Japan's plan, saying they're already grappling with the legacy of nuclear testing that had happened decades ago. Now, how do you believe the release is going to affect the Pacific Islands fishing industry? Could you elaborate more?
Yes, and so thank you for actually mentioning the fact that the Pacific Islands have been victim to nuclear weapons, just as Japan has. So that's very important to point out. Well, it's not only the Pacific Islands that would be affected. As I was saying, and there's another thing that's very important about radiation. People generally have understandably a fear of radiation, radioactive materials. You can't hear it, you can't feel it, you can't taste it, just like COVID was very scary for a lot of people. Right. So if you can imagine that you have tuna with elevated levels of cesium arriving in South Korea or other places in the Pacific Islands, then the reaction would be that people would not want to eat those fish. And I'm not going to take any sides on whether it actually is dangerous for you or not. It doesn't matter. It's people's reactions that's important, and that will affect the economy. And we know, for example, if you remember, I was in Korea at the time when Fukushima happened. People were very afraid of eating fish from Japan, even eating Korean fish.
Right.
And should they go outside at the time? And I remember those questions that I got at that time. So I understand this, and I think it could severely affect economies. There have been some estimates. There was a Chinese estimate of something like $218 billion US, very large number. But I mean, I could imagine something like that happening.
Right. Walter, the reason why other countries are all raising their voices is because, like we have been saying, the plan to discharge the water is not just a domestic matter for Japan, but a global and transnational issue, as it can cause transboundary pollution. Now, what is Japan's take on concerns from other countries?
Well, I personally think that many countries are rightfully concerned by the decision, and Japan did itself no favors given its opaque crisis response in the wake of the disaster. But that said, it seems that the number of countries that are raising their voices is still seen as quite minimal in Japan. And so Japan is trying to assuage any fears that may arise, and it has been holding things like study groups, working visits for diplomats and embassy staff, as well as for foreign correspondents based in the country. I think there is a bigger fear that this may immediately come to damage Japan's soft power. But right now, I think that the government bureaucrats think that it's a risk that they are willing to take. They see that time will prevail, just as the number of countries that continue to ban Japan produce from Fukushima has been falling since the disaster.
Right, Doctor. Considering more than 1 million tons of water stored in around 1,000 tanks is hampering its decommissioning and is in danger of leaking in the event of potential, earthquakes or tsunamis, it seems like the contaminated water needs to be at some point be dealt with, right? What are other possible options? And if the ocean discharge is the only conceivable plan, how should it be done?
Okay, so that's a great question. And in the memorandum that we wrote, we actually made suggestions. Suggestions that don't have transboundary concerns. Suggestions that TEPCO really should have thought of back in 2016 when they released some of their reports about alternative options. So we have three ideas which don't have these concerns. One, for example, because tritium has a half-life of 12.3 years, you could just because this whole process of discharge will also take a very long time. I use the word discharge. If you just let it sit there for a very long time, then it will just naturally decay and the problem will be solved if it's Alps treated water and Alps works the way it should work. So that's one option. The second option is that what you could have is use it for concrete. And I know this sounds strange, but a lot of water is used for concrete. And if you use water for particular, bridges and things like that, it's something like 40 million tons of concrete is actually used in Japan per year. So if you think about 1 million ton of water and a 50-50 ratio between water and concrete, then you could see that this could really work for things like bridges where there's no access to people. The other very important point is that what's interesting about tritium is it's got a very low, and that's also why people don't, are not so scared about it as they should be, or at least in the physics community, let's say. It's got a very, very low energy beta. And what that means is if it's in concrete, it will be easily absorbed. And in fact, if you take a Geiger counter, click, 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 and you attach it right to the front of the concrete, you wouldn't detect anything. So you could imagine that this could be used for bridges, places where there's not much activity with people would not be interacting with it. And then slowly that will quickly decay, well, pretty quickly it will decay. And so that's also a possibility. The other possibility, that's the third suggestion that we have, is bioremediation. And what that means is that you could have, for example, the Pacific oyster. These are ideas that TEPCO really should have thought of. It's not for us to make these suggestions, but Pacific oysters are very good at filtering water.
Wow.
And in fact, if you take 5 of these oysters and put them in a tank of water, it will filter about 1 ton per day, which is pretty impressive. And so you could potentially use these oysters to filter the radioactive materials. And then, of course, when the oysters die, you put them into a waste repository or somewhere where it's a safe place. But then you could really filter all the water. So there are these options, and they wouldn't have this transboundary concern. And really, it's up to TEPCO to have thought of this. It's just that releasing it in the sea is 1/10 of the price of what the next option would be, because in 2020 they actually published what the costs were of all these different options that Walter was talking about.
Right. It was truly an informative time, but unfortunately this is all the time we have for today's edition. But Doctor, thank you so much for your insights. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And of course, thank you, Walter Shim, for your insights as well. We really appreciate it, and thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories on the issues happening in South Korea and, of course, around the globe. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.